Hello mountain bikers, Vital MTB in the house, coming at you with another product review. Here to talk about something new and exciting from Hope today. If you were already a fan of Hope's aluminum cranks, but you thought perhaps they were a bit overly complicated, or if you're just a fan of lightweight, strong aluminum cranks in general, then you're going to want to keep watching as we take you through the latest and greatest. Hope's first entry into the crank market had a lot going for it. It's pretty light, very strong, robust. It did have a slightly complicated spindle-to-crank arm interface, which made installation maybe a bit more involved than it needs to be. But other than that, we tested it for a long time. In fact, these very crank arms have been on our bikes for over 2 years, and we had great results out in the field. But Hope is never one to stop moving forward, and they took another look at what they were doing with their cranks and came up with something new. In typical Hope fashion, it's called the Hope Crank Evo. Not a lot of bonus points for creativity in naming, but the product hopefully makes up for what the name lacks in punch. So let's have a look then, shall we? Out with the old and in with the new. First of all, it's orange. What else we have in here? Crank arm and a BB to fit it to our bike. Now, before we dive into the details of this new crank, let's take a look at one particular aspect of the old crank that was perhaps a little bit annoying. The spindle-to-crank arm interface was actually comprised of several parts. The spindle itself featured a set of cuts to allow it to expand inside the crank arm and lock it into place. To install the crank, you'd slide the crank arm over the spindle and then use a specific tool to firmly press it into place. In the next step, you'd install an expanding cone, once again with help from the tool used in the previous step, before moving on to installing a locking bolt in the final step. To remove the crank arm, you'd have to remove the locking bolt as well as the expanding cone, and then use the bearing preload ring to press the crank arm off the spindle. This last step required another specific tool to execute. Now, all these special tools were supplied in the box with the crank, which meant you didn't have to make any additional purchases to be able to work on your crank. That's nice, of course, but it's still another set of tools to keep track of. If all that sounds like a lot, it sort of is. It wasn't too bad in practice. As we previously mentioned, we ran this crank for over 2 years. It's been on and off several bikes, and once you get the hang of it, it really isn't that difficult to do. You just have to do the steps, obviously, in order, and you'd end up with a very solid interface that never caused any problems. However, Hope felt they could simplify the whole thing, and we're on to the Evo. The Evo is, as its name implies, an evolution of the previous version. To make this evolution happen, Hope used FEA tools to figure out where they could remove some material from the crank arm, and the result is a crank that's actually both lighter and stiffer, but more importantly, features this vastly improved spindle-to-crank arm interface. There's still a splined axle, but it's no longer cut because it no longer needs to expand to secure the crank arm. Instead, now you just slide the crank arm onto the axle, torque it down to spec using a 10mm Allen key, and then use the bearing preload ring to take up any remaining side-to-side play. In the redesign process, Hope also moved the removable crank arm over to the drive side, which means that it now comes off as a whole unit from the drive side, making it much easier to access the chainring for maintenance, or maybe installing or removing a chain guide, as the case may be. On the topic of the chainring, there's a specific tool used to secure the lock ring that holds it into place. It's easy to use and it gives great results. We've never noticed any creaking from the chainring to crank arm interface, and we've never had it develop any play over time either. The new spindle interface is now of the self-extracting design, so when you want to remove the crank, simply use your 10mm Allen and crank it in the other direction. It'll eventually pop straight off the spindle and you're good to go. The lock ring that we previously talked about is made from aluminum, which is a really good idea. If you have any experience with cranks with a plastic lock ring, you'll know that those are prone to breaking every now and then. All told, at the end of the redesign process, Hope had knocked about 15% off the weight of the crank arm itself, leaving it at about 630 grams or so with the chainring for the sample we've tested, which is a 73mm BB with 175mm crank arms. Definitely a competitive weight for a crank designed for everything from cross-country to World Cup downhill. In fact, you've probably seen Adam Brayton hunt these to flat fairly regularly over the past couple of seasons already, in case you needed any extra assurance. The Evo crank and chainring are available in Hope's usual 6 colors, and the price remains the same as the previous version, 235 British pounds, translates roughly to about 325 US dollars. Out on the trail, reviewing a crank is not very exciting, because if the crank is doing its job, it just sits there and lets you get on with riding your bike. Well, that's exactly what Hope's Evo crank has been doing for us in the couple of months that we've had it on our bike now. It feels every bit as stiff and solid underfoot as any of the recent competitors that we've tested. And the whole test period has been completely devoid of any drama. We've not seen any play develop, not side to side, not between the chainring and the spindle. The bearings are still spinning smooth, although we are at the end of our winter here and they've not been subjected to daily British mud baths. Hope being a British brand, they assure us that mud resistance is part of their design spec. Previous experience shows their BBs will last a decent amount of time. Don't really know of any BBs that last more than a decent amount of time, to be honest. We typically end up complaining a bit every now and then when we have to swap our BBs. Like, really? I have to swap our BBs? Again? First world problems. The chainring is of the narrow wide variety, and it does a pretty good job of keeping the chain on. The anodized finish is not super resistant when it comes to the areas being attacked by the chain. Par for the course for anodized chain rings. It's what you get when you want that extra bling. But other than that, the general finish is holding up pretty well. We've put some scuffs on the cranks here and there, we've banged them on some rocks, but everything is still running smooth and looking pretty good. And there you have it. That was a quick look at Hope's Evo crank, the evolution of their aluminum crank. Who is this crank for? Well, like we said in the beginning, if you're a fan of lightweight yet very strong cranks, this one could very well be for you. Hope does tend to charge a bit of a premium for some of their products, but you do get something that's very well made, that will stand the test of time, and of course, let's not forget, looks pretty nice too on your bike. If you're a Hope fan, you don't need any convincing, you probably run this on your bike already. If you're not already, take another look. The price tag is slightly steep, but you do get a quality product. And one that's 100% made in the UK, if that kind of thing is important to you. Thanks for tuning in. Over and out.